All right, we have just finished our predictions about what we think the sea devil is before we start reading the story. So let's go ahead and get started reading the story. The man came out of the house and stood quite still, listening. Behind him, the lights glowed in the cheerful room. The books were neat and orderly in their cases. The radio talked importantly to itself. In front of him, the bay stretched dark and silent, one of the countless lagoons that border the coast where Florida thrusts its great green thumb deep into the tropics. It was late in September. The night was breathless. Summer's dead hand still lay heavy on the land. The man moved forward 6 paces and stood on the sea wall. He dropped a cigarette and noted where the tiny spark hissed and went out. The tide was beginning to ebb. Somewhere out in the blackness, a mullet jumped and fell back with a sullen splash. Heavy with roe, they were jumping less often now. They would not take a hook, but a practiced eye could see the swirls they made in the glassy water. In the dark of the moon, a skilled man with a cast net might take half a dozen in an hour's work, and a big mullet makes a meal for a family. The man turned abruptly and went into the garage, where his cast net hung. He was in his late 20s, wide-shouldered and strong. He did not have to fish for a living, or even for food. He was a man who worked with his head, not with his hands. But he liked to go casting alone at night. He liked the loneliness and the labor of it. He liked the clean taste of salt when he gripped the edge of the net with his teeth, as a cast netter must. He liked the arching flight of 16 pounds of lead and linen against the starlight, and the weltering crash of the net into the unsuspecting water. He liked the harsh tug of the retrieving rope around his wrist, and the way the net came alive when the cast was true, and the thud of captured fish on the floorboards of the skiff. He liked all that because he found in it a reality that seemed to be missing from his 20th century job and from his daily life. He liked being the hunter, skilled and solitary and elemental. There was no conscious cruelty in the way he felt. It was the way things had been in the beginning. The man lifted the net down carefully and lowered it into a bucket. He put a paddle beside the bucket. Then he went into the house. When he came out, he was wearing swimming trunks and a pair of old tennis shoes. Nothing else. The skiff, flat-bottomed, was moored off the sea wall. He would not go far, he told himself, just to the tumble-down dock half a mile away. Mullet had a way of feeding around old pilings after dark. If he moved quietly, he might pick up 2 or 3 in one cast close to the dock, and maybe a couple of others on the way down or back. He shoved off and stood motionless for a moment, letting his eyes grow accustomed to the dark. Somewhere out in the channel, a porpoise blew with a sound like steam escaping. The man smiled a little. Porpoises were his friends. Once, fishing in the Gulf, he had seen the charter boat captain reach overside and gaff a baby porpoise through the sinewy part of the tail. He had hoisted it aboard, had dropped it into the bait well where it thrashed around, puzzled and unhappy, and the mother had swum alongside the boat and under the boat and around the boat, nudging the stout planking with her back, slapping it with her tail, until the man felt sorry for her and made the captain let the baby porpoise go. He took the net from the bucket, slipped the noose in the retrieving rope over his wrist, pulled the slip knot tight. It was an old net, but still serviceable. He had rewoven the rents made by underwater snags. He coiled the 30-foot rope carefully, making sure there were no kinks. A tangled rope, he knew, would spoil any cast. The basic design of the net had not changed in 3,000 years. It was a mesh circle with a diameter of 14 feet. It measured close to 15 yards around the circumference and could, if thrown perfectly, blank 150 square feet of seawater. In the center of this radial trap was a small iron collar where the retrieving rope met the 23 separate drawstrings leading to the outer rim of the net. Along this rim, spaced 1.5 inches apart, were the heavy lead sinkers. The man raised the iron collar until it was a foot above his head. The net hung soft and pliant and deadly. He shook it gently, making sure that the drawstrings were not tangled, that the sinkers were hanging true. Then he eased it down and picked up the paddle. The night was as black as a witch's cat. The stars looked fuzzy and dim. Down to the southward, the lights of a causeway made a yellow necklace across the sky. To the man's left were the tangled roots of a mangrove swamp. To his right, the open waters of the bay. Most of it was fairly shallow, but there were channels 8 feet deep. The man could not see the old dock, but he knew where it was. He pulled the paddle quietly through the water, and the phosphorescence glowed and died. For 5 minutes, he paddled. Then 20 feet ahead of the skiff, a mullet jumped. A big fish, close to 3 pounds. For a moment, it hung in the still air, gleaming dully. Then it vanished. But the ripples marked the spot, and where there was one, there were often others. The man stood up quickly. He picked up the coiled rope, and with the same hand grasped the net at a point 4 feet below the iron collar. He raised the skirt to his mouth, gripped it strongly with his teeth. He slid his free hand as far as it would go down the circumference of the net so that he had 3 points of contact with the mass of cordage and metal. He made sure his feet were planted solidly. Then he waited, feeling the tension that is older than the human race. The fierce exhilaration of the hunter at the moment of ambush, the atavistic desire to capture and kill and ultimately consume. A mullet swirled ahead and to the left. The man swung the heavy net back, twisting his body and bending his knees so as to get more upward thrust. He shot it forward, letting go simultaneously with rope hand and with teeth, holding a fraction of a second longer with the other hand so as to give the net the necessary spin, impart the centrifugal force that would make it flare into a circle. The skiff ducked sideways, but he kept his balance. The net fell with a splash. The man waited for 5 seconds. Then he began to retrieve it, pulling in a series of sharp jerks so that the drawstrings would gather the net inward like a giant fist closing in on this segment of the teeming sea. He felt the net quiver and knew it was not empty. He swung it dripping over the gunwale, saw the broad silver side of the mullet quivering, saw the gleam of a smaller fish. He looked closely to make sure no stingray was hidden in the mesh, then raised the iron collar and shook the net out. The mullet fell with a thud and flapped wildly. The other victim was an angelfish, beautifully marked, but too small to keep. The man picked it up gently and dropped it overboard. He coiled the rope, took up the paddle. He would cast no more until he came to the dock. The skiff moved on. At last, 10 feet apart, a pair of stakes rose up gauntly out of the night. Barnacle encrusted, they once had marked the approach from the main channel. The man guided the skiff between them, then put the paddle down softly. He stood up, reached for the net, tightened the noose around his wrist. From here, he could drift down upon the dock. He could see it now, a ruined skeleton in the starshine. Beyond it, a mullet jumped and fell back with a flat, liquid sound. The man raised the edge of the net, put it between his teeth. He would not cast at a single swirl, he decided. He would wait until he saw 2 or 3 close together. The skiff was barely moving. He felt his muscles tense themselves, awaiting the signal from the brain. Behind him, in the channel, he heard the porpoise blow again, nearer now. He frowned in the darkness. If the porpoise chose to fish this area, the mullet would scatter and vanish. There was no time to lose. A school of sardines surfaced suddenly, skittering along like drops of mercury. Something, perhaps the shadow of the skiff, had frightened them. The old dock loomed very close. A mullet broke water just too far away, then another nearer. The man marked the spreading ripples and decided to wait no longer. He swung back the net, heavier now that it was wet. He had to turn his head, but out of the corner of his eye he saw 2 swirls in the black water just off the starboard bow. They were about 8 feet apart, and they had the sluggish, oily look that marks the presence of something big just below the surface. His conscious mind had no time to function, but instinct told him that the net was wide enough to cover both swirls if he could alter the direction of his cast. He could not halt the swing, but he shifted his feet slightly and made the cast off balance. He saw the net shoot forward, flare into an oval, and drop just where he wanted it. And that is where we're going to stop today. So this is the end of part 1 of the Sea Devil. We'll continue again in a little while.